I've spent a lot of the past 10 years in particular thinking about the church and culture and what it means as Christians to live creatively in the midst of culture. I define culture very simply, and I borrow this definition from Ken Myers of Mars Hill Audio. Culture is what human beings make of the world in both senses. So it's what human beings make in the sense that it's the actual stuff that human beings make of the world. Everything from tables to MacBooks to tilapia when you cook it. Anyway, we take the natural gifts of the world and we culture them, we cultivate them. But it's not just the stuff that we make, it's also the meaning we make, that other sense of making something of the world. So that culture is the human quest to sort out the meaning of a world that seems to ring and resonate with meaning, but does not come with an explanation of its meaning. And culture is just this millennia-long human project to try to find meaning in a seemingly meaningful, yet also seemingly meaningless world. And of course, the way we make sense of the world is by making stuff. That is, we make cultural artifacts that interpret the world. So culture is always about, kind of manufacture of stuff, but it's never just things in themselves. It's things as interpretations, things that make sense. Now, how does this relate to preaching? Well, preaching addresses directly the question of what we make of the world. And the best preaching interacts with culture. That is to say, it is not separated from or divorced from the culture-making project that's going on all around the preacher and his congregation. But the best preaching interacts directly with what are our neighbors making of the world, both in the sense of the stuff they're making. So they're making iPads. What do we make of the iPad? They're making interstate highways. What do we make of the interstate highway? But also in the sense of the interpretations that are on offer in any given culture. And this is why you can't pick up a sermon, preach somewhere else, and preach it again. It's always contextual. At least good preaching is always contextual. And always embedded in a particular cultural moment and a particular cultural story. And so preaching joins, it's not something separate from culture. It joins this cultural quest to make something of the world. And the sermon itself is a cultural artifact with a long history, its own story of how people started to make these things called sermons. And so in our preaching, we're also making a cultural artifact, a 20 or 30 or 50-minute address that's designed to enter into culture and remedy something that's missing or offer some interpretation that's missing. There's sometimes a resistance to the idea that preaching is culturally embedded, because I think there's a fear that means that the truth that we proclaim is culturally relative and changes with whatever the fashions are of culture. Well, of course, the truth is that what we're offering comes entirely from outside of our own culture and our own story, in a sense. It comes from thousands of years ago, a place where none of us have ever lived, a cultural tradition that is very distant to us, and to the extent that we have access to it, mediated through several thousand years of transmission. So there's actually no danger if you're preaching. Now, if you're just giving a motivational talk, certainly that could be completely culturally bound and very relative and sort of relevant in the worst sense. But if you're really preaching, your whole purpose is to bring this event or events in history that come from outside the culture of your congregation into their cultural sphere and offer an alternative to just the dominant values of the culture that they live in. However, if you were to attempt to simply proclaim a truth that's divorced from your cultural context, I think you would find that it does not land. It doesn't connect, because it doesn't answer the world that this particular group of people inhabits. So all preaching has to be committed to something outside of the culture in which it takes place. But also, I think if we're to love our neighbor, it has to be deeply also committed to the culture where the preaching takes place, as a place where God's word could become true again. When you begin thinking seriously about culture, I think you find that the distinction between form and content is not as helpful as we might think. We tend to think of content as the message, and form as just the neutral carrier of a message. But in fact, if culture is what human beings make of the world, and if the way that we make something of the world is to make stuff, then the forms that we make are as much about interpreting the world as whatever content we put in those forms. So take the 3-minute pop song, verse, chorus, bridge, chorus. That is a cultural form. Now it can have all sorts of content, and you can have Christian versions of that of the pop song that have Christian content to them, but they all share this ABCB form, and the form itself interprets the world. The form itself says this is what life is like. For one thing, it can be summed up in 3 minutes. Like all of life's experiences can be somehow condensed into this 3-minute form. And if you live within the horizons of that form, you are going to believe certain things about the world. You're going to believe certain things about love. Can a love story be told in ABCD? Or is it more complicated than that? Does it require maybe 10 minutes or a two-hour feature film? Right? We need many forms in order to do justice to the complexity of the world. Unfortunately, what often happens is we think all we need to pay attention to is the content of culture and the content of our preaching. And we neglect the fact that the forms of our culture and the form in which we preach is probably sending a deeper, more formative message to our congregation and is shaping us more than any content we would ever infuse that form with. So I actually want Christians to become less preoccupied with the content of our message and much more attentive to the way that the forms that we use shape what people believe the world is like, what people believe good news would be, what people believe the bad news is. All these essential gospel questions are actually wrapped up in form. There are many people who would say the form of the sermon, the cultural good that is the sermon, has reached the end of its shelf life. It's an expired cultural form. And so we need to radically revise it. I think this is both right and wrong. The reason it's wrong is that true, durable, good cultural forms never actually die. They don't have to be lost. If they were well made to begin with, and if they're well honed by history and time, they are of enduring value. And we see this even in a technological age where people, when television came along, thought that radio was going to disappear. Well, no, radio is thriving. Now, it's changed, but it's thriving. When the internet came along, people thought, well, no more television. Well, actually, people watch more television now than they did 20 years ago. Cultural form, same with the book, right? The book is not going away. So cultural forms, if they're good, should actually be conserved and even defended and kept alive, rather than indulging in this idea that we move on from form to form. No, we add forms in culture rather than subtracting and then adding. So it's wrong to say the sermon is over and done. It's not. However, it is right to say preaching in our cultural moment will look dramatically different from preaching in Charles Finney's cultural moment or Sojourner Truth's cultural moment. People hear differently today. I rarely now try to speak for more than 10 to 15 minutes without stopping for people to have some other kind of experience. And that is just a reality of how people engage. But that doesn't mean I give up on well-crafted verbal communication. I don't give up on the form of the sermon, but I think we do have to ask, how does it respond to our cultural moment now? Naturally enough, everyone's experimenting like wild to try to figure out what new form works, and we have to be realistic and realize most of these experiments are going to be total disasters, because that's true in all culture making. Most cultural experiments fail, and fail spectacularly. Over time, we will discover some methods of changing the form of preaching that do not where the surgery doesn't kill the patient. At the moment, most of the attempted surgeries on this sick patient called preaching are disasters. I think this idea of just allowing people to interrupt you with Twitter to interrupt you with thoughts that are too short to do justice to what you've just said, and without raising their hand or in any way engaging in a relational way. It's a terrible idea, and 10 years from now, no one is going to be doing that. In fact, at this moment, today, the day we're taping this interview, the cool kids all let people tweet questions to them, and the measure of how good a preacher you are is how distracted people are by their desire to tweet what you're saying. I am absolutely sure that in 10 years, the measure of great preaching will be people actually stop their tweeting in order to listen and attend. Attention is going to become scarce, not distraction and blogging and tweeting and so forth. And the question is going to be, do I have anything worth saying enough, and am I saying it well enough that people are willing to suspend all those other claims on their attention? That's going to be the measure of great preaching. But right now we're trying all these ways to get people distracted, which is the last thing we need. At the same time, there are very hopeful experiments going on, and I use projection minimally, which is to say I don't put every point up there usually. But I do, at certain moments, use an image that is worth engaging, and is worth engaging at length. Not just an illustration, but something of enough significance as a visual image that it deserves our attention. And it not doesn't just illustrate, but it adds to what we're talking about. And I find those add to the attention of the people I'm preaching to, rather than distracting or dissipating attention. So all these experiments will have to happen. Most of them will be judged failures. There's no real shame in that, as long as we don't get attached to our failures and realize the goal is becoming aware of, as a body, the presence of God in our midst, God addressing us, offering us a way to live, and responding to God. We'll sort out in time what cultural forms help us in our moment to do that. Cultural goods are always designed for and delivered to, you could say, a given public. Culture is a public thing. It's a shared thing. If I just write something in my journal and I never publish it, never make it publish, it's not culture. It's writing, but it's not a cultural good that shapes some public. So obviously a sermon, assuming people show up Sunday morning, has a public. So a sermon is a cultural good for that group of people. And the first way in which a sermon is a cultural good is it shapes the culture of that particular congregation in a very significant way, both because of its form, but also the interpretation it offers of what the world is about, what we're about as God's people in the world. Now, in another sense, a sermon is rarely a cultural good, because its public rarely extends beyond the people in church that day. And so to our neighbors who don't come to our church, it's very hard for the sermon to be a cultural good, because it doesn't address them, it doesn't reach them. It's like an entry in the private Christian journal, and we all read this journal, but unless it's translated into public, into my town, into my neighborhood, into my city, in some way that it becomes accessible to a wider community, then it really never reaches the status of a cultural good for that wider community, no matter how important it is for the church. Now, should sermons be a cultural good in that wider sense? They were at one time, and I think many of us feel kind of nostalgia for the time when someone would preach a sermon and it would be of such import that it would be reported on the papers. I mean, this happened in the 19th century all the time. And it happened at key moments in the 20th century. What is in every important respects, a sermon is preached on at the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and becomes one of the most dramatic moments of oration in American history, because it was done in public, because it didn't just happen in a church, but Martin Luther King Jr. preached it in front of America, really. But that's by far the exception. So the question is, can our more ordinary sermons, our prosaic sermons, be a real contribution to the culture around us? Well, only to the extent that they are somehow published, made public. That doesn't have to mean you send them to the newspaper and the newspaper publishes them, because who is most likely to make your sermon public? It's the people in your church. And are you equipping them to take what you teach them into their places of work, the schools where they teach and study, the playgrounds where they play and oversee the play? Are you giving them something that they could take into public? I think that's a great question for every preacher to ask. Am I offering my congregation something they could take to their neighbor, and without their neighbor necessarily having to accept every aspect of the gospel, that this could be in some way good news, or at least intriguing news for their neighbor, that it could be communicated? And this in turn means that I think culturally serious preaching has to begin with the question, not just what does my congregation need to hear, but what do their neighbors, what would I want my neighbors to hear from my congregation that I could share with my congregation, that they could in turn publish for a wider community. It would be one of my deepest hopes that we would learn to preach in a way that encourages and equips Christians to be creators and cultivators of culture. Mostly, I do not think that is happening right now. And the fundamental reason I think it is not happening is I don't think we really are passionate about our people's call to be present in culture. And this is partly because often as ministers of the gospel, we are not fully present in culture. So much preaching, when it addresses culture, addresses it in the register of critique. That is to say, we mine the surrounding culture for examples of how to do it wrong or badly or sinfully in order to provide a kind of foil or contrast for our picture of what the true good life is. And I'm struck by how rarely I hear preachers using culture as anything other than a sort of admonitory example, like this is how not to do it. So when we preach about business, we talk about greed. When we preach about politics, we talk about corruption. When we preach about media, we talk about pornography or exploitation. We never talk about, or rarely do I hear preachers talk about, business as the creation of opportunity and wealth, politics as the right ordering of justice, media as the bringing to life of stories that are true and good and beautiful, even if painful. Why don't we tell those stories? Why don't we talk about culture in that way? Because that would give our members of our churches a way to imagine themselves as Christian actors in those places. When all we tell are the negative stories, and God knows that there is much to critique in culture, but when all we tell is those stories, then the implication is that a true follower of Christ will be somehow separate from that. And guess where they'll be? They'll be serving as volunteers in the Sunday school room. There's nothing wrong with volunteering for Sunday school. But a friend of mine was talking with his pastor years ago at a church in Boston. And his pastor said, we have a woman in our congregation who litigated, on behalf of the Environmental Protection Agency, litigated the cleanup of Boston Harbor, one of the major environmental cases of the 20th century. And the pastor said, it occurred to me the other day that every year we celebrate that she teaches second grade Sunday school, and we have never celebrated that she was the lead litigant on the cleanup of this part of God's creation called Boston Harbor. Now, by all means, celebrate the volunteers in your churches and the lawyers in your churches who also teach Sunday school. But also, is there something to celebrate in the legal work they are doing? Yes, it's God-honoring. It's an example of culture at its best. Why don't we match some of those examples of culture at its worst with examples of culture at its best, because that's what orients Christian people, I think, to what they can hope to be in the world as their culture makers in the world. If we don't offer a biblical vision of what people are doing in culture, they will absorb the cultural vision of what you do in culture. So if you live in a culture dominated by ambition, people will orient themselves culturally around ambition. If you live in a culture dominated by reputation and pleasing people, that's how people orient themselves. And their culture making will reflect the values that their culture offers them. The great privilege we have as Christian preachers is to offer another better story to explain what people are doing 6 days a week. That when you are coaching a soccer team or building a small business or writing a novel or working as a journalist or farming or whatever your people do, you are not just part of the story their culture tells them they're a part of. You are part of a bigger, better story. And that story begins in a garden and ends in a city. It begins with God cultivating the world and ends with all the fruits of human image bearing being brought into this glorious new heavens and new earth in which God is fully worshipped and honored through the worship of people in a city, in a culturally complex environment. That is a story they are never going to hear in the school where they teach, or the business where they work, or on the farm that they work on. But they can hear that in your church, and it can give dignity and motivation and significance to every aspect of human work. If we don't preach that, they'll never hear it. If we do preach it, I believe they will become better culture makers, and it will give them much more deep reasons to come to church on Sunday in order to connect their life of faith with their life in the world, rather than just having a compartmentalized, spiritualized life that is very disconnected with what they're doing for the rest of their week.